In the summer of 1943, the British High Command thought the American Army was a group of amateurs, useful for protection, but not for winning. Montgomery's plan to sideline them in Sicily was supposed to be the final word until Patton decided to break every rule in the book. August 17, 1943. On the morning of the 17th, Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard's 3rd Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, entered Messina, Sicily. American soldiers took control of the port. American flags went up over the city. Hours later, at 10:30 a.m., a British patrol from Montgomery's 8th Army arrived, expecting to claim the prize. They found Americans already in position. The race was over, and the British general who was supposed to win had lost to the American general he'd tried to park on the sidelines. They didn't just find the city occupied, they found the amateurs leaning against the wall, smoking, holding the keys. The silence of that British patrol spoke louder than any victory speech. This wasn't just about two commanders competing for headlines. This was the moment the United States Army proved it was no longer Britain's junior partner. This was when American soldiers showed the world they weren't amateurs learning from their betters. This was the 72-hour impossible drive that changed everything. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, the first major Allied assault on Axis territory in Europe. The dress rehearsal for everything that would follow. The plan was developed by British and American planners working under General Harold Alexander, who commanded the 15th Army Group. Alexander was British, experienced, and believed strongly in giving Montgomery what he wanted. Of the 161 staff officers at his headquarters, only 12 were American. The planning was a British show. This wasn't a meeting of allies, it was a room full of teachers who didn't think their students would ever graduate. To the British, the Americans weren't partners. They were a glorified guardrail for Montgomery's glory. The operational plan gave Montgomery the starring role. His British 8th Army would land on Sicily's southeastern beaches and advance up the eastern coast along the main highway. Objective: Messina, the port city at Sicily's northeastern tip. Capture Messina, and you controlled the island. Montgomery's route was direct, good roads, coastal terrain, the shortest path from landing beaches to the objective. This was where the decisive battles would be fought and won. Patton's American 7th Army got a different mission. They would land west of the British beaches and protect Montgomery's left flank. Supporting role, security duty. Make sure no Germans attacked Montgomery's forces from the west while the British advanced north. The plan assumed Montgomery would face the strongest German resistance. His 8th Army had the experience to handle tough fighting. The Americans could guard the flank and learn from watching professionals work. Montgomery's planning documents estimated 6 to 8 weeks to reach Messina. Careful preparation at each phase. Build up overwhelming force before attacking. Minimize casualties through methodical advance. No unnecessary risks. It was textbook Montgomery. The same approach that had worked at L'Allemagne. Slow, cautious, professional. When Patton saw the plan, he understood exactly what was happening. The British were giving themselves the glory mission while parking the Americans in a supporting role. Montgomery would capture Messina and claim credit for taking Sicily. American soldiers would sit on the flank and watch. Patton had just spent months rebuilding American credibility after Kasserine Pass. He wasn't going to let Montgomery turn Sicily into a British showcase that reinforced the narrative of American inferiority. But the plan was set. Alexander had approved it. The landing dates were fixed. Patton would have to execute his assigned mission unless he found a way to change the mission. Route 124, the Vicini, Coultyron Road, the main highway running north along Sicily's eastern coast, from the landing beaches toward Messina. the best road on the island. Direct, well-maintained, built for moving armies quickly. The original planning documents assigned this road to both British and American forces. It was wide enough for multiple divisions to advance simultaneously. Both armies could use it to push north together. Then Montgomery changed the plan. He claimed operational necessity required giving Route 124 exclusively to the British 8th Army. American forces would have to find alternative routes to the west. The justification was logistics. Montgomery argued that having two armies sharing one road would create traffic jams and confusion. Better to give the main highway to one force and have the other use secondary routes. The real reason was pride. Montgomery wanted the main road because the main road led to Messina. Whoever controlled Route 124 controlled the direct path to victory, and Montgomery wasn't going to share that path with Americans. Alexander approved the change. He trusted Montgomery's judgment and believed British forces should have priority for the decisive advance. The Americans could manage with what was left. The decision forced Patton's 45th Division to countermarch all the way back to the coast to find a new path. Troops who had already advanced inland had to turn around and march back, exhausting them before they could even start their assigned mission. They walked back through their own dust because they were in the way. It wasn't a logistics decision. It was a personal insult to every American soldier who'd landed on that beach. When Patton learned that Route 124 was now exclusively British, he was furious. This wasn't operational necessity. This was Montgomery ensuring the British got credit for capturing Sicily. Patton studied his new assignment: protect Montgomery's flank, use secondary roads, stay out of the way while the British advanced. His staff officers prepared plans for the supporting mission. Position forces to guard against German counterattacks from the west. Advanced slowly behind British progress. Contribute to Montgomery's success. Patton looked at the map and saw something his staff didn't. If the Americans couldn't use the eastern road, they would take the western road. And if they moved fast enough, they could reach Messina before Montgomery got there. It wasn't in the plan. It wasn't authorized. It would create friction with Montgomery and Alexander. Patton didn't care. The British had just stolen the main highway to ensure American forces stayed in supporting roles. He was going to prove that American speed and aggression could beat British caution, even without the best roads. July 10, 1943, D-Day for Operation Husky. Allied forces landed on Sicily's southern coast. British and Canadian forces under Montgomery hit the southeastern beaches. American forces under Patton landed to the west at Gela and Leyte. The landings were successful despite rough seas and scattered airborne drops. Within 24 hours, both armies had established beachheads and begun advancing inland. Montgomery's 8th Army pushed north along Route 124 toward their first objectives. Syracuse fell on July 11th. Augusta fell on July 13th. British forces were making steady progress up the eastern coast. Patton's 7th Army secured the landing areas and turned west to accomplish their assigned mission: protect Montgomery's flank, prevent German counterattacks from the western part of the island. American soldiers sat in defensive positions and watched British forces advance north. They had successfully completed the D-Day landings. They had defeated Italian and German counterattacks. They were ready to drive into the island's interior, and their orders were to guard the flank, wait for Montgomery to advance, support the British operation. By July 14th, the pattern was clear. Montgomery advanced slowly up the coast. Whenever his forces encountered significant resistance, they stopped to build up overwhelming force before attacking again. This was Montgomery's doctrine: never take unnecessary risks. Always ensure you have crushing superiority. This approach gave the Germans time to strengthen their defenses. Every day Montgomery spent preparing for his next attack was a day German engineers spent building fortifications. And while Montgomery advanced cautiously, Patton's much larger 7th Army sat idle, guarding against threats that weren't materializing. The western part of Sicily had minimal German presence. There was nothing to defend against. Patton went to Alexander with a proposal. His forces were doing nothing useful sitting on the flank. What if he took the western half of Sicily instead? Drive to Palermo, capture the western ports, then turn east and advance toward Messina from the west. Alexander was hesitant. That wasn't the plan. Montgomery had the main mission. Patton was supposed to support, not launch independent operations. But Alexander could see the same thing Patton saw. The 7th Army was wasting time and resources sitting idle. At least Patton's proposal would accomplish something. Alexander gave vague authorization. Patton could conduct reconnaissance in force to the west. If opportunities presented themselves, he could exploit them. It was ambiguous permission, not quite approval for a major operation, but not a prohibition either. Patton took it as a green light, and when Alexander later sent an order to halt the drive on Palermo, Patton's chief of staff, Hobart Gay, claimed the radio message arrived garbled and requested retransmission. The clarification conveniently didn't arrive until Patton had already entered the city. Patton wasn't just disobeying orders, he was weaponizing a radio malfunction to save American pride. July 19, 1943, Patton unleashed the American 7th Army in one of the most spectacular advances of the war. His objective? Palermo, Sicily's capital on the northwestern coast, distance over 100 meters through mountainous terrain. Montgomery's staff had estimated it would take weeks to cover that distance. The roads were terrible. The mountains were difficult. Any competent commander would advance cautiously. Patton gave his division 72 hours. The 3rd Infantry Division under Major General Lucien Truscott led the advance with the 2nd Armored Division and elements of the 82nd Airborne following. They moved day and night. When roads became impassable, engineers blasted new routes. When resistance appeared, tanks bypassed it and kept moving. Truscott had trained his division in high-speed marching. The Truscott trot 5-8 for short bursts instead of the standard 3-amp. This was how they covered 100 millimeters of mountain so quickly. This wasn't a march. It was a 100-mile lunge through a furnace. Patton drove his men to the breaking point because they all knew one thing. Bleeding in the mountains was better than sitting on a British flank. Italian defenders were shocked by the speed and aggression. American columns appeared where they weren't supposed to be. Towns that expected days of warning suddenly had American tanks in their streets. Entire garrisons surrendered without firing a shot because they couldn't organize defense against an enemy that arrived too quickly. Patton drove forward with the lead elements. He pushed commanders to move faster. When officers said their men needed rest, he told them to rest in Palermo. When supply officers said the logistics couldn't support the pace, he told them to figure it out or be relieved. His soldiers responded to the aggressive leadership. They were finally being unleashed, finally being allowed to show what American forces could do when they weren't sitting on British flanks playing support. July 22, 1943, 72 hours after the advance began, lead elements of the 2nd Armored Division entered Palermo. The capital of Sicily had fallen to American forces. The numbers were stunning. Over 100 miles covered in 3 days through difficult terrain. Thousands of Italian prisoners captured. Massive quantities of supplies seized. And it had been accomplished while Montgomery was still grinding slowly up the eastern coast. The press went wild. American newspapers ran headlines about Patton's lightning drive to Palermo. The general who had cleaned up Kasserine Pass was now capturing cities faster than anyone thought possible. British newspapers were more restrained. They noted that Palermo wasn't strategically important. Messina was the real objective. Patton had conducted a flashy operation in a secondary theater while Montgomery fought the main battle. Montgomery sent messages to Alexander complaining that Patton was grandstanding. The Western campaign was a sideshow. The real fighting was happening on the eastern coast, where British forces faced serious German resistance. But everyone who understood military operations saw the truth. Patton had just demonstrated that American forces could move faster and strike harder than British doctrine allowed. He had covered more ground in 72 hours than Montgomery covered in 12 days. And he had done it without the best roads, without priority for supplies, and without the starring role in the operation. Montgomery's humiliation was complete when Patton radioed his next objective. The 7th Army was turning east. They were heading for Messina, and they were going to get there first. While Patton was capturing Palermo in 72 hours, Montgomery's 8th Army had run into a problem named Catana. Catana sat astride Route 124, the main highway north to Messina. It was heavily defended by German and Italian forces, who had used the time Montgomery spent preparing his advance to build strong defensive positions. Montgomery's plan was to punch through Catana with overwhelming force, then continue north to Messina. But the Germans weren't cooperating. Every British attack was beaten back, with heavy casualties. Montgomery tried flanking movements. He launched amphibious operations to land troops behind German lines. He brought up additional artillery and air support. Nothing worked quickly enough. The British were stuck. And every day they spent stuck at Catana was a day Patton's forces could use to advance east from Palermo. Montgomery's staff calculated that even with the setbacks, they would still reach Messina before the Americans. Patton had farther to travel. His route was more mountainous. He would have to fight through German forces retreating in front of Montgomery. The mathematics said the British would win the race. What the mathematics didn't account for was Patton's willingness to drive his troops beyond what doctrine said was possible. July 28th, Montgomery finally captured Catana after 2 weeks of fighting. His forces had suffered significant casualties, taking the city that should have fallen quickly. The advance could continue north, but the schedule was badly disrupted. Montgomery sent messages to his commanders emphasizing that Messina remained the objective. The 8th Army would get there first. Patton's Western campaign was irrelevant theatrics, but Montgomery's chief of staff knew the truth. They had given Patton too much time. If the American general pushed his forces as hard as he had pushed them to Palermo, he might actually reach Messina first. Montgomery received this assessment and dismissed it. The Americans didn't understand mobile warfare. They would get bogged down in the mountains. British experience and professionalism would prevail over American enthusiasm. He was about to discover that Patton didn't care what doctrine said was possible. August 1st, 1943. Both armies were now driving toward the same objective from different directions. Montgomery approaching from the south along Route 124, Patton approaching from the west along Sicily's northern coast. This wasn't officially a race. Alexander's headquarters insisted both armies were conducting coordinated operations to trap German forces on the island. But everyone from private to general knew the truth. Whoever entered Messina first would claim victory. Whoever arrived second would spend the rest of the war remembering this moment. Montgomery pushed his exhausted troops harder than his doctrine normally allowed. He launched more amphibious operations to bypass German defensive positions. He accepted higher casualties to maintain momentum. But he couldn't escape his own caution. Every time British forces encountered strong resistance, Montgomery stopped to prepare overwhelming force before attacking. It was the method that had won Elamine, and he trusted it absolutely. The Germans weren't defending Sicily the way they had defended North Africa. They were conducting a fighting retreat, delaying both armies while evacuating forces to mainland Italy. Every day Montgomery spent preparing attacks was a day German engineers spent preparing the next defensive position. Patton's forces moved continuously. When they hit resistance, they bypassed it. When roads became impassable, they blasted new routes. When supplies ran short, they captured German and Italian stocks. American soldiers were exhausted. They were fighting on minimal rest, advancing through mountains, sustaining casualties to maintain speed. But they could see Messina getting closer. They knew they were racing the British, and they knew Patton would never forgive them if Montgomery got there first. August 8th, Montgomery's forces were 40 firsts from Messina. Patton's forces were 50 minares away. The British had the shorter distance, better roads, and the advantage of attacking along the main highway. But Patton had momentum. His forces were moving faster than British forces, even with the worse roads. He was gaining ground every day. Montgomery sent a message to Alexander, complaining about coordination with American forces. He suggested that having both armies racing for the same objective created unnecessary confusion. Perhaps the Americans should halt and let the British finish the operation. Alexander knew what Montgomery was really saying. He was afraid Patton would beat him to Messina and wanted authorization to make the Americans stop. Alexander refused. Both armies would continue operations. First Army to reach Messina would secure the city. The race was on. Patton was running out of time. His forces were still 35 mm from Messina. Montgomery's forces were only 25 mm away. The British were closing in faster than the Americans. Patton looked at the map and saw an opportunity. Sicily's northern coast had beaches all along the route to Messina. What if he used the Navy to leapfrog troops behind German defensive positions? He ordered his staff to organize 3 amphibious operations. Land troops ahead of the current front lines, force the Germans to retreat or be surrounded. His staff officers protested. They didn't have enough landing craft. The Navy wasn't prepared for improvised amphibious assaults. The coordination with ground forces would be nightmarish. Patton told them to make it work. August 8th, first landing at Sant'Agata. American troops came ashore behind German lines. The Germans retreated to avoid encirclement. August 11th, second landing at Brolo. This one nearly became a disaster. The 2nd Battalion, 30th Infantry, was almost cut off and annihilated. German forces counterattacked before the main American advance could link up. The battalion fought desperately until relieved. August 16th, final landing at Spatafora. Unopposed. The Germans were already evacuating. Patton had leapfrogged his way up the coast through aggressive gambles that nearly backfired, but they worked. Montgomery heard about Patton's amphibious operations and was furious. This was exactly the kind of reckless risk-taking that professional soldiers avoided. Patton was gambling with his troops' lives to win a publicity race. But Montgomery also recognized what was happening. Patton was going to reach Messina first, unless the British moved faster. August 14th, Montgomery launched his own amphibious operation. British troops landed near Scaletta, 12 meters south of Messina. The British were now racing against Patton using his own tactics. But it was too late. Patton's forces were already closer, and they were moving faster than exhausted British troops could match. August 16th, American forces were 3 mirrors from Messina. British forces were 15 miles away. The mathematics were clear. Barring disaster, the Americans would enter the city first. Patton radioed his lead division with explicit orders: "Get to Messina tomorrow." He didn't care how tired they were. He didn't care what resistance they faced. Tomorrow morning, American soldiers would be in Messina before the British arrived. August 17, 1943. On the morning of the 17th, Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard's 3rd Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, entered Messina. American soldiers fanned out through the port city, securing key positions. There was no dramatic battle. The Germans had already evacuated. The last Axis forces had crossed to mainland Italy during the night. Messina was undefended. But that didn't matter. The race wasn't about defeating Germans. It was about who got there first. American flags went up over the city. Patton arrived hours later and made a theatrical show of inspecting the captured port. He congratulated his soldiers. He posed for photographers. He made sure every war correspondent knew that American forces had reached Messina first. The British 4th Armored Brigade from Montgomery's 8th Army arrived in the afternoon. They found American soldiers already controlling the city. The race was over. Montgomery did arrive in Messina later that day, but he deliberately avoided the formal handover ceremony. He wouldn't give Patton the satisfaction of witnessing his humiliation publicly. When the British officers reached the city center, Patton greeted them with exaggerated courtesy. He thanked them for their contribution to the campaign. He offered to brief them on the situation in Messina. He rubbed their faces in his victory while pretending to be gracious. He didn't just beat them. He invited them in for coffee. It was the ultimate power move, thanking the British for their contribution to a city he had already conquered. The message was clear to everyone watching. The American army was not in subordinate status to Montgomery's forces. American soldiers had crossed worse terrain, covered more distance, and arrived first. The British press tried to spin it. They wrote that Montgomery had faced stronger German resistance, that the Americans had the easier route, that Messina wasn't the real measure of success in Sicily. American newspapers had no such ambiguity. Headlines celebrated Patton as the general who beat the British to the prize, the man who proved American forces could outfight anyone when given the chance. But the real vindication wasn't in the newspapers, it was in what happened next. German commanders drew their own lessons. They described Patton as dangerously unpredictable and aggressive. They characterized Montgomery as cautious and methodical, to the point of being easy to defend against. One German report captured it perfectly. Patton is the most dangerous Allied commander in the theater. His forces move faster and hit harder than any others. Montgomery is professional but predictable. Patton had proven his point. But he had also created an enemy who would remember this humiliation for the rest of the war. Montgomery's response to losing the race was revealing. He claimed it had never been a race. The operation was coordinated. Both armies had accomplished their objectives. He argued that his forces had faced stronger German resistance. The Eastern Road had more enemy divisions. The Americans had advanced through areas the Germans weren't defending seriously. He insisted the timeline had always been flexible. 6 to 8 weeks was an estimate, not a commitment. Reaching Messina on August 17th was perfectly acceptable, even if the Americans arrived a few hours earlier. Montgomery looked at the same maps as everyone else, but he refused to see the same reality. He started positioning the Sicily campaign as a strategic success that proved his operational methods. He wrote after-action reports emphasizing British achievements. He gave interviews describing how his forces had defeated the main German resistance while the Americans handled secondary operations. The more Montgomery talked, the more it became clear he was making excuses. Professional soldiers don't need to explain away victories. Montgomery's defensive explanations told everyone he knew he had lost. behind closed doors, Montgomery complained to his staff about Patton's grandstanding, about American commanders who cared more about publicity than proper military operations, about how the race to Messina had caused unnecessary casualties. His chief of staff had to remind him that despite the longer route, Patton's 7th Army suffered roughly 10,000 total casualties compared to the 12,800 sustained by the British East. The American advance had been more efficient by every metric that mattered, and George Patton had just made him look second-rate in front of the entire Allied command. The feud that would poison Anglo-American operations for the rest of the war had truly begun. German commanders who fought against both armies in Sicily drew explicit comparisons. Their after-action reports and post-war testimony revealed exactly what they thought of each general. General Hans Valentin Hube commanded German forces in Sicily. His assessment was blunt. Montgomery was predictable. Patton was dangerous. Hube described Montgomery's pattern: build up overwhelming force, conduct methodical attacks, consolidate after each advance. It made Montgomery easy to defend against because German commanders knew what was coming. They could prepare positions, time their retreats, and keep British forces contained. Patton was different. German intelligence couldn't predict his moves. He attacked when doctrine said forces should rest. He bypassed strong positions instead of reducing them methodically. He launched operations with inadequate supplies and made them work anyway. Field Marshal Albert Kessler, who commanded all German forces in Italy, reached the same conclusion. British forces under Montgomery were professionally competent but lacked boldness. American forces under Patton were aggressive to the point of recklessness and far more difficult to contain. General Fridolin Pfäuninger owned Ettlin, who would later defend Cassino, and who commanded German forces in Sicily, captured the difference perfectly. Defending against Montgomery is a mathematical problem. Defending against Patton is a continuous emergency. The Germans respected Montgomery's mind, but they feared Patton's soul. This assessment reached Allied intelligence. Eisenhower and other senior commanders saw what German generals thought of their subordinates. Montgomery was respected but not feared. Patton was genuinely dangerous. It vindicated everything Patton had argued about aggressive tactics. The Germans themselves confirmed that speed and audacity created more problems for the enemy than methodical caution. But it also created problems for the Allied command. Montgomery was the senior British general in theater. He couldn't be publicly criticized or sidelined without damaging the alliance. Churchill backed him absolutely. So Allied commanders had to work around the reality that their most celebrated British general was less effective than their most problematic American general. They would spend the next 2 years managing that tension. The Sicily campaign created a permanent rift between Patton and Montgomery. What started as professional rivalry became personal hatred. Montgomery never forgave Patton for beating him to Messina. In his mind, the American general had grandstanded and taken unnecessary risks to steal glory that rightfully belonged to British forces. Patton's 72-hour drive to Palermo was reckless showboating. The race to Messina was undisciplined competition that compromised operational security. Montgomery's post-war memoirs described Sicily as a successful operation where British forces defeated the main German resistance while Americans handled secondary objectives. He mentioned Patton's arrival in Messina as an afterthought, not as a defeat. Patton never forgave Montgomery for trying to sideline American forces. In his view, Montgomery had stolen Route 124 to ensure Americans played supporting roles, while British forces claimed credit. Montgomery's careful planning was just cowardice, disguised as professionalism. His post-battle excuses proved he knew he had lost. Patton's diary entries from Sicily reveal his contempt. He wrote that Montgomery was overly cautious, and that the race to Messina proved American arms were superior. He characterized British tactics as slow and ineffective compared to American aggression. The feud poisoned Anglo-American cooperation for the rest of the war. In Normandy, during the Battle of the Bulge, during the drive into Germany, Patton and Montgomery competed instead of cooperating. Their staffs fought over supplies, logistics, and operational priorities. The numbers didn't lie. Aggressive American tactics produced faster victories at lower costs than cautious British professionalism. And every time Montgomery and Patton worked together after Sicily, both men remembered who got to Messina first. Sicily changed everything. Without that 72-hour drive to Palermo, Patton never commands Third Army. Without beating Montgomery to Messina, American forces stay in supporting roles. The race to Messina was when the United States proved it was no longer Britain's junior partner. Not in industrial capacity, not in manpower, in military competence, but the race came at a cost. While Patton and Montgomery competed for the city, the Germans executed Operation Largo. They evacuated 101,000 men and 10,000 vehicles across the street of Messina to mainland Italy. The Allies were looking at each other instead of closing the trap. While the two titans were glaring at each other, the enemy slipped through the back door. It was a victory for the headlines, but a missed opportunity for the history books. Still, what Sicily proved mattered more than what it cost. Patton's aggressive tactics, Montgomery's cautious excuses, German commanders drawing explicit conclusions about which general was dangerous, and George Patton was the general who proved it to the world.